In the next couple videos, I'm going to show you how I made this platform style bed. You could make the platform, you could add the headboard. The headboard is a little more complicated than the platform, but you can really change up the headboard or just make the platform. And I made this entire thing out of Douglas fir 2x6s, which are available at Lowe's. The legs are 4x4s, and that lumber for myself was around $100. So I'm calling this a DIY project, but I do use a plane in this video, which I know a lot of DIYers don't have, but there are workarounds to not having a plane, so I'm keeping it with the DIY title. It's not a super complicated build. I don't need a lot of fancy machinery. I'm going to start by making the legs. If you don't know a lot about lumber, when you go buy a 4x4, it's actually going to be 3.5 by 3.5, and these 2x6s are actually going to be 1.5 by 5.5. Now, I bought these 2x6s almost 2 years before I started this project, because this has been on my to-do list for quite a while. So this lumber's been sitting in the basement for almost 1.5 years. You could see how much it has shrunk. This used to be 5.5 inches. That is something to consider if you're using dimensional grade lumber. When you go and buy it from the store, it's still at probably 20% humidity, relative humidity in the lumber, so that's how much moisture will be in it. In most places, so my geographic area, you want that down to almost about 9%. So when you buy this stuff, it will still shrink on you. Now, for what they use it for in construction, that doesn't really matter, but for making furniture, it can matter. So I had bought this way ahead of time, giving it a couple months to reach that relative humidity I needed at. So if you're going to build something like this, I know it can be a pain, but I do recommend buying this stuff, stacking it properly so air can get around all of the parts before using it. That's one of my bigger tips for using construction grade lumber. As you saw, all I did was cut these pieces down to size. My dimensions on the height of this are based off the fact that I wanted the platform to be the exact same height as the two side tables I already had. So I just sent them through the planer to square them up. Realistically speaking, you don't really need to do that if you don't have a planer, as long as they don't have a lot of exterior markings or the surface is pretty clear. Since I cut these down into such small sections, you're not going to have a lot of undulations with dimensions in small sections like this. And if you don't have a planer for the legs, sanding them should be fine. And then I just went through and marked center. I marked out from center. I knew I was going to plane my 2x6s to about 1.25 inches, so all of my grooves I want to be roughly 1.25 inches. I marked one piece. That's going to be the piece I use for all of my setup, and all the other ones are going to match that. When it comes to making parts like this that need to fit together, following my marks is important, but what's really important is making sure that all 4 of these are identical. Now, because I'm making my rails so thick, which I don't recommend making the bed rails much thinner than this, because you really need that strength to support the weight of the people, not only the bed structure, but the people in the bed. So like I said, my bed rails are about 5 inches. Now, my blade on my table saw only goes up to 3. There's many ways to do this. I chose ways to do it in my shop to utilize the tools I have, but also not to do anything super fancy so that people can replicate it. So all I'm doing is I'm using this tenoning jig to rough out this mark, and I'm going to remove the bulk of the material with the table saw. Then I'm going to remove the rest of the material I can't get with the drill press, and then I'm going to route to my lines with the router. It's a longer process to do it this way, but it's going to be highly, highly accurate. If you have a heavy-duty mortising jig and you have a bigger bit, you can cut these out that way, but like I said, this is a way to do it as well. So right now I'm going to be at about 3 inches, and since I said my opening is about 1.25 inches, I happen to have 1 1/8 inch spade bit, which I'm going to do in the drill press. Now, you can cut full mortises in the drill press, but in my experiences, especially with these spade bits, not so much with Forstner bits, if you're going super deep, they sometimes have a tendency to wander on you a little bit. So that's why I started with the table saw instead of just the drill press. and I'm going to remove just the bulk of this top side material with the drill press. Now the joint that this is a castle joint. So the joints I'm cutting now are the bridal joints for the joint. So these are going to intersect each other. So obviously they're going to be four parts for your rails to go into, and then the rails will have half laps that slide into these, which makes it a three-way joint, and it is extremely strong. It's also visually appealing, and within reason there is a little bit of leeway to still make it work, which makes it ideal for people that might not have a ton of woodworking experience. So now that I have the bulk of my material removed, I'm going to use a flush cut trim bit to remove the rest. I'm making a very simple jig out of some scrap 3/4 inch ply. Basically this piece in the middle is the exact same size of the opening I want. I have these two fences on the side which are wide enough to allow for the fence of my router to ride on them safely. I didn't have a big enough piece of ply, so you could see I had extended it, and I'll be able to cut out that material with the router bit. Now you can cut full mortises and bridal joints with router bits, but I find that they get overpowered pretty easily, so that's why I decided to remove the bulk of the material, and then those bits are kind of designed after you remove the bulk of the material to come in behind and clean up those edges. I'm just going to simply add some fences to the bottom of this jig. I'm using super glue to do this. I realized that you can get an accelerant so that this stuff sets up quicker. I don't have it, and I wasn't going to buy it just for this project. And that's how that sets on there. So you can see it's going to line up with my pencil marks, and it's going to make all of these perfect. The fences on the side will lock it in place in the exact same position on all four sides. And then for the front, I'm just adding 2 extra fences so that it can line up with the front as well. So it's very easy to slide this on and off all these pieces. Like I said, I made this all with scrap in about 10 minutes, and I based it off of the marks I had on there, and I could clamp it in the back so the whole thing is held secure while I used the flush cut bit. So I have a couple of these flush cut bits, but I use the 1-inch one. This one's made by Freud, not a sponsored post. I just do like the router bits, and I can just come in and clean that up. You can see it doesn't go all the way to the bottom, and you'll see how I deal with that once I go through and do this first round of routing on all of them. Before I take the fence off, I use it to line up my chisel and just square up the corners, because that router bit is going to give you a rounded bottom on all of this, and you want to square that up to slide your half laps into it. You can see I just turn the piece, move the jig, line everything up, clamp it in place, and just route through. So while this seems like a long multi-part process, it does create an extremely accurate corner. It's pretty important that these ones are all accurate and line up perfectly. I take this bed apart multiple times throughout this build, and I don't want to have to worry about only one piece fits in one corner and this corner was a little bit smaller than the other. This really creates accurate, repeatable results for these bridal joints in the corners. You can see it's pretty easy once you have everything going. So now that I have that top side flush, all I have to do is take my jig off, and the bearing will now follow the part that I routed, and that is how I can go through and remove the rest of that bottom material. So you can see that bearing is going to ride on that clean edge that I created with the jig and mimic it down below and remove that little bit of material. This is what it looks like when it's all said and done. You can see the bottoms are rounded over, so I'll go through and clean those up with a chisel, but I was really happy with how these turned out. And there is my original. So like I said, this build is all Douglas fir. You can see the difference between the Douglas fir and whitewood you'll commonly see in the hardware store. The Douglas fir is a little more expensive. I've seen it at Home Depot and Lowe's, and I specifically picked out pieces with really nice grain patterns. So they'll come in like a whitish sapwood hue and then a red hue as well. I planed all this stuff down to about 1.25 inches, but realistically speaking, what I'm doing is as I'm planing, I'm making sure it's fitting in my joint. Now, like I said, this stuff is going to come in 1.5 inches. If you don't have a planer, I used to cut a 1/16 of an inch off both sides to do this before I had a planer. It is doable. It's a lot of extra work. Technically, you could leave this at 1.5 inches. There will be some undulations on the surface of this stuff, but personally, when I use dimensional labor, I find it looks better if it's cut down to thinner pieces, mimicking different types of furniture. It gets a little bulky when you use it in actual size. So then with some scrap, like I said, I cut these down to 5 inches. You could see in that last clip, I just removed the rounded edge off of both of the sides to get it down to 5. I did a test cut for this bridal joint, this interlocking lap joint, and then I did all of the math. Now, because these pieces extend outward over the frame, I'm measuring for the bed, but I also have to add the thickness of the joint and then the thickness of the overhang. The reason I have an overhang is because I'm putting top side cantilevered pieces on top of the rails. Now, I'm drawing out all the math here because this is for a queen size bed. You can make this exact size bed for a twin, a double, or a king. I would just recommend pausing this and changing your numbers. I'm working off of a queen size mattress. I'm adding 1 inch around the entire perimeter, and then I'm adding the thickness of the overhang, the thickness of the joint in order to get everything to work. That was basically what all that math was. And like I said, if you want to make something like this for a size of a bed that's not a queen, you can just pause it and take my numbers and just add on to what you need. So once I had all of that math laid out, you could see I had circled my final dimensions for the queen. I can go through and cut down my pieces. I like to cut the ends off of both because they're usually a little rough, and then I could go through and make the laps. These are, I think, sometimes I do these on the radial arm saw, but they were a little too thick for the radial arm saw, so the carriage would hit the bottom. So I just set up some sawhorses on the side of my table saw because this is going to hang over the table quite a bit, and that sawhorses will make this a much safer cut. I set up a stop, and I'm going to cut all of these on the table saw. So you can see I cut one side, I'm going to flip it over and cut the other. So I'm going to cut the outer edge of this joint on all of my pieces. Just like the bridal joint on the legs, it's not so much important what dimensions you decide on, it's important that every single piece is identical. So using the stop, setting up the fence properly, and cutting all of these at the same time is what's going to give me accurate results. So then once I had that outer edge cut, I could make another pencil mark because like I said, I want these to fit into the material I planed. So if I'm planing them to 1.25 inches, I don't recommend making all your cuts beforehand. Prepare your lumber, figure out what size it is, and then work as you go. So if your dimensions are a little off from mine, you can just tweak them to make everything fit. So you can see I just moved the fence over, I cut those 2 outer edges, and then I could go through, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to chisel off some of that material because it pops off pretty easily on this lumber. You can see I'm popping it off in the back there, and then I could just go through on the table saw now and make a bunch of kerfs and then clean that up with a chisel. And then if you're careful, you could hold this against your fence and slide it back and forth, and this perfectly plows out the bottom of that joint. That is what it looks like. I know this, like I said, this looks like a lot of work. I started this project back in March because it is for myself, so I had to fit it in between different projects. So it took from March until July to do it in my shop, but realistically speaking, if I was starting to do this in the shop for a customer, portions of these legs with this frame I could easily have fleshed out in a day. Now, like I said, this joint is somewhat forgiving, and to show you that, I overcut my sample piece. You can see I added about a good 1/8 of an inch onto these pieces. When I put them together, they don't fit together quite nicely, but when you slide them into that joint, it still locks everything in place. So if you're making this and you're a DIYer and your measurements don't match up perfectly, I still think it's worth it to assemble it because it is a three-way joint. If one of the joints is off a little bit, but the other two aren't so bad, it should still work. And then I just assembled this. Now these joints were really tight in the beginning because I zeroed in on them quite a bit. After I took this apart for the first time, I just took a hand sander and sanded down the inside of all the joints a little bit, and it slid apart pretty easily. But that is going to be the basic frame I'm starting with. In the next series of videos, I'm going to add the top side rails. Realistically speaking, if you just wanted a simplistic piece of furniture, you probably don't even need those top side rails. You could add slats and a mattress and be okay. But I did want mine to be a little more stylized than that.